what I wanted to talk about today was your family.
Okay.
Of origin.
Of origin.
Mm-hmm. And I thought it would be fun to kind of to start with your father. I know you were talking today about crazy what does he say?
He used to say, oh, now you got me confused. Cuckoo banana.
Cuckoo banana.
To talk about people that weren't all there. Cuckoo banana. And I've told several of my friends, and they love it. They go around now saying, well, you know, that person is cuckoo banana. He had a way with language, even though English was certainly not his first language. He knew Greek, Turkish, Russian, and some French, because he had lived in all of those countries when he was very young as a shop boy. Do you know all this? Do you want me to tell you? He was the youngest, I think, of 12 or 13 children. So he was very young when his parents died, and he lived in Asia Minor, and he went to Constantinople, Istanbul, and he was a shop boy for an Armenian man. And he told me this story, which I love. He said that the Turks used to have pogroms, and they would give any Turk the right to kill any Armenian. And the owner of the shop he worked at was Armenian. So when this happened, it was going to last for 3 days, he went and hid on the roof and told my father, if they come by, you tell them this is your shop. So my father told me that, and I said, well, how did they know you weren't Armenian? He said, because an Armenian looks like an Armenian, a Jew looks like a Jew, a Greek looks like a Greek, and a Turk looks like a Turk. I said, not in America. In America, we all look the same. So he hit me on the head and said, Hazo Amerikanaki, which means silly American. He used to say that a lot to us, to his children. Hazo Amerikanaki. He was an orphan, and then he went to Constantinople and worked as a shop boy. I don't know how many years, but then his next stop was Russia. And he worked in Russia, I guess, again as a shop boy. And he used to say during the Stalingrad siege, during the Second World War, you know, that those poor people for 3 years were surrounded by the Nazis and couldn't get any food or supplies in. So millions starved to death. But my father and mother were very interested in what was happening in the Second World War because they had relatives in Greece. My mother had sisters and her mother there. So they used to follow, every night they would follow the campaigns. And my father used to say, those Russians, they'll make it, because when I was there, their lice were this big. And if they could live with those lice, they can live with those Nazis. So that was one of his stories. I think he then went to France and worked a while, and then he came to America. None of us really knew his age. We thought he was born in 1880, but we're not even sure of that. We know he was in his 40s when he married my mother. And first of all, when he came to Ellis Island in the usual way, his name was Kosmas Kosmidi. And of course the immigration guy said, poop, the last Greek that came by here was Spero. Your name is Spero Kosmas. So that became his name. But that's not an uncommon story. That happened a lot. So then, I remember at one point he used to carry bread from New York to New Jersey on his back. He worked in a factory, he broke his leg, and I don't think it was ever healed properly, and he always had he had a crooked leg. It didn't affect his walking, but if you ever saw him in a bathing suit or shorts, you would see that crooked leg. He then came to America. Well, he did the bread, and then the next thing I heard, he started these movie theaters. And Spiros Skouros, who was a big person, a Greek in film, the story is that he came and asked our father's advice at one point. So he for a while was riding high. And then he went to Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, and had a couple of stores, and that's where he met my mother, who had gone there. Well, that's another story. Let's continue with my father. Now my father. He retired. He sold his store when I was 8 years old.
Do you have any memories of the store?
Oh yeah, definitely, because he had candy. He used to make the candy, and I'd go behind the counter and steal it. And he made sandwiches and ice cream. He had 3 flavors, but Isley's up the street had 26 flavors. So once a little boy came there with his mother, and she said, "What ice cream do you want?" He had vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. He made them. And he said, "I want to go to Isley's." And my father said, "Go. I'm not serving you here." He was very insulted, but when he told me that, I said, "Well, Papa, you know, there's pecan," and that was another time he hit me on the head like that, and said, "Hazo Amerikanaki," silly American. So, but he had that, and he sold it in 1940. He kept the building, of course. And in fact, there was a movie house in the building, and there was some arrangement that he kept they had to use part of his property to get to the movie theater, and so we had free passes all the time I was growing up. And that was a big thing. I would go every Saturday afternoon for the double feature, and that was the highlight of the week. And my parents went too. So and then he also built the movie house, that was called the State Theater, and the one across the street was the Washington Theater. So those were 2. But by my early memories, he didn't own them anymore.
What was his personality like?
It was very outgoing, very unsophisticated. He was not, my mother was very cool and controlled. He was not. He would say things, the story would go that he would say things when there was company, and my mother would kick him under the table, and he would say, "Why are you kicking me, Hari?" During the war, we owned 3/4 of an empty lot next to us, and he had a huge victory garden. And he used to, since he was the only man around, all the other men in the neighborhood were in the army, he would make little baskets of his produce and take it around and give it to all these women who were, home alone with the babies. So he felt responsible. He was that way, and he had opinions about everything, and it was interesting. Once when I was a teenager, the school I went to was, you had to walk through this black neighborhood to get there, and then you went into the snooty part of town where the school was. So I would go at night to these different parties, and then I'd walk home alone. And once when I was walking, this carload of white boys came by and started harassing me. So I saw an older, he probably was in his 40s, black man across the street, and I crossed the street and I went over to him and I said, "Will you please walk me home?" And he said, "Whose daughter are you?" And I said, "Spero Kosmas." He said, "Oh, Spero, of course I'll walk you home." So he talked to everybody. He said racist things about blacks and Jews, which again, is not uncommon for that era, that on an individual basis people could appreciate each other, but they still had all these racist concepts.
Do you think did he convey to you anything about being Greek? Or did he ever reference his background, or and particularly the Turkish Greek thing?
Well, those people, both my mother and my father, were raised in Asia Minor, which was Turkey. They were of Greek. There was always a large, before 1922, there was always a large Greek population there. So though they spoke and lived the Greek culture, they also lived in Turkey. And I think that's what a lot of the immigrant groups, but since I know the Greek better and the Greeks from Asia Minor, I think that was so in tune to them because it had been about 400 years under the Ottomans. So they didn't, what I always felt and rebelled against as a kid was that they wanted us to stay Greek. And I always felt I was American. And I remember another story when I came home for my first year of college, which was in Vermont. So I had been away solidly till Christmas. And I was on the street. Our town, Washington, Pennsylvania, only had maybe 12 Greek families. And of course, we were the most cultured. This was my mother's thing. And so she was always standoffish. But I saw Mrs. Papadopoulos in the street wearing black. She looked awful. So I came home and I said to my mother, "Mama, what happened to Mrs. Papadopoulos? Her husband died?" "No." Someone's very sick in the family?" "No." "Well, why is she wearing black?" "Her daughter married an American." So that was, in that era, which was the 50s, the late 40s, 50s, that was the mentality. Though my ex-husband and I often talked about it, and we said, our conclusion was that my mother was so bright, she would have acquiesced if one of her daughters married, quote, an American. Of course, my husband now, my second husband, is an American, but they never met. My parents were both dead by then. But that was very strong in the Greek community at that time, that you didn't marry outside of the Greek. And then the other thing the Greeks have is they still go by what part of Greece you're from. And in fact, when I lived on the island of Zakynthos for about 11 or 12 years. I would go there for 4 or 5 months, and there was a very educated, she was a teacher, Greek woman, and she asked me where my family was from, and I said Asia Minor. This was in the 80s, about 1981, 82, and she said, "Oh, the refugees." So even though the big upheaval was 1922, 60 years later, the mainland Greeks, many of them still thought of the Greeks from Asia Minor as refugees. So that's...
Did either of your parents ever talk about their identity in terms of being Greeks from Asia Minor versus mainland Greeks?
No, they never talked about it, but again, you always felt they were much more comfortable with Greeks from Asia Minor. I mean, that's where their friends were. But maybe they also felt somewhat inferior from the Athenians, because when I married my first husband, they were Athenians, and they got along very well right away. And I think, I don't know.
Well, of course, Helen tells the story that when Yanni's family came from New Smyrna.
Yes.
They came from Smyrna, they went down to Crete, and then they went to Athens. And they were shopping for an apartment, and they wanted a place with a bathtub. And people would say, "Oh, is somebody sick?" And they said, "You see, they weren't as sophisticated."
That's right. That's what my parents said too. But they used to, Smyrna in particular, used to have opera and theater. They all said that. All the people that talked about being from Asia Minor and going to Athens, that Athens was backward compared to where they came from. But again, there were villagers. And villagers are villagers, but the people from Smyrna, the city, or Constantinople, Istanbul, that was different. They did have high culture.
But you think there was a class difference between your mother and father?
Oh, definitely. She was, we always heard she went to the French convent in Constantinople. So for that era, she was extremely well educated for a woman. And when she came to America, she was on a tour with a very wealthy aunt and uncle. They were going through Europe and they were going to America. By the time they got to America, the big upheaval of 1922 was going on. So they told her, being the oldest in the family, that she should marry a Greek American so she could help her family back in Greece. So she said, sure. And they said, and we have someone for you to meet. So she went to meet him, and she did not like him because he wore white socks. That was my mother. She had very definite ideas, and white socks apparently were not cultured. So then what was she to do? She went to the YW and she said, I speak, read, and write 4 languages, which I guess were Greek, English, French, Turkish. And I can be a governess, but it has to be for a Greek family. And they found her this position in Punxsutawney, and that's where she met my father. So that was very gutsy of her in 1922 to say, no, I won't marry him, but I'll be a governess. That was unusual.
Did they ever speak Turkish to each other?
Oh yeah, when they didn't want us to understand.
So they both could speak Turkish?
Oh yeah. I think it probably, as the years went on, they got less fluent. But yeah, they'd talk Turkish at the dinner table, so we wouldn't know what was going on. But you could tell from the intonation a lot. She used to read also every afternoon. She'd take a nap and she'd always be reading. I don't know where she got her books, because I don't remember her going to the library, but she always either had a book or the Greek newspaper used to come in the mail.
So did she, you think she read both English and Greek?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And
and French. She'd read in French too.
She would?
Yeah.
What do you think was her attitude toward, having these daughters and they're, you said...
She was impatient. She was impatient with us. It was obvious she should not have been a mother. She didn't enjoy it. But I think part of that was that she had these twins, first of all, and then one had cerebral palsy. That was a big thing that bothered her. Then she had a sister that had TB that she took care of until the doctor came to the house to check on the little kids and said, you have your sister here with TB? You can't do that around the children. So then her name was Anna, and she went to a sanitarium, and then she insisted on going back to Greece, where she died of TB. Again, in that era, I think almost every family had someone with TB. Maybe not, but a very high percentage. I guess it's comparable to cancer now. You know someone that's had it or is just getting diagnosed. And my mother always she said several times she felt very badly because she had a young maid at that time who got TB and died from it. So it was obvious she had gotten it from this aunt, Anna.
We know where we came from to a certain extent, but we don't have records. We're not the kind of people that can go and search and hope for a genealogy.
No.
And I was wondering, is that something you've ever been curious about, or do you feel like just knowing that they're from Asia Minor and that they're ethnically Greek?
For me, that's enough. What was very interesting, there's a writer, Alice Munro, from Canada. You know her work, who I've loved her work. Her latest book really pissed me off the rock, something, it's a collection. And she goes back to her background. And to me, goes on, and it's like, as I was reading it, I thought, who cares? You know, that's your history. And it's important to you, and you've written about it. And then Sarah, my stepdaughter, whose background could be traced, also read it and said, oh, it just wasn't, it was boring, it wasn't good. Did you read it?
No. Did you see the series that was on PBS about that this African-American professor from Harvard?
Skip Gates.
Did you see that?
I saw part of it. He went back, right?
He went back, and he took 9, prominent African-Americans, Oprah Winfrey and Whoopi Goldberg, and did their genealogy, and then did their DNA, and, found things.
See, I find that much different than going into our background, because they were violated and brought as slaves. So it is important to know what part of Africa they came from, how they're related. I mean, because they had not, again, there were no records. And in our case, it's like, obviously we were never slaves. So it's always that I guess there's another thing my mother imparted is a certain feeling of superiority, definitely. That the Greeks were so great. And I also used to fight against that as a kid, because I'd mutter to myself, they're not so great. And in fact, that's another story. There was a man repairing our stove. I very vaguely remember this. Between the kitchen and the dining room, there were these swinging doors, and apparently my parents and Kiki, my aunt, and my uncle were sitting in there. And I was, I don't know, 5, 6, 4, 5, or 6, and I remember talking to him, and I said to him, and this is another family story, you know those people in there? They're geeks. They're geeks, 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 and they think they're so great, but they're not. And the poor man, I remember the poor man, I wanted a reaction, and he just kept his head down and was going, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there was always that rebellious feeling in me that I wanted to be American and they wanted to keep on to the Greek heritage. That was...
And did you ever have the experience where you felt people didn't respect you as much because you were Greek?
Yeah, because we grew up in a small town, Washington, Pennsylvania, 20,000. And there were strict social classes. We lived in North Washington, which was middle class, but there also was a middle upper class in East Washington. And I went to a girls' school. There were only, at the peak, 8 of us in the class. So there was a lot of, there were a couple girls from East Washington. I'd go to their homes, and there was something off. And then once I had one of those girls, we were riding our bikes, and she ended up at our house around supper time. And my mother said, well, why doesn't so-and-so stay for supper? And she put out, we ate in the kitchen, but my mother put a tablecloth on the table with cloth napkins. And afterwards, this friend, her name was Jamie something, said, oh, wait till I tell my mother that you use tablecloths. Like, I said, well, why wouldn't we? But it was, to them it was this exotic thing, different thing. So you felt that. It was not growing up in New York City or a big city where there was, I think, much more cognizance of all different people.
So, as far as, one of the things that intrigues me is I think, we think we're Greek. We believe we're Greek. But that was certainly a very, as you said in the first story, kind of a diverse area.
Yeah.
And they did live there as ethnic Greeks for a long time, but surrounded by Turks.
Right.
I mean, how do we know there isn't some other?
That's a good point. But to me, who cares? Yeah. Like sometimes I think I must have some Russian in me because I have these, I don't know.
Well, I did a
DNA.
I did a DNA.
Oh,
but
you
I
did?
did it. It was mitochondrial, which means it was only the matrilineal line. So it was.
Yes.
So, and there's this, and they have these spots where there's high DNA matches with your thing. And there's a spot out in Asia.
There is.
Yeah. And Spero and I are going through it now and trying to understand exactly what it says, and then we're going to have him do one.
Oh,
that should
yes.
Look at both father and mother's side, so we can get a little more sense of what's going on. But so that, because obviously, and this is like thousands and thousands, so many thousands of years back, but there's because like Diana's got those kind of almost Persian look to the eyes, and
which my mother had.
Your mother looked very. She was kind of dark.
Yeah.
As your grandmother was.
Yes.
But then there were the other siblings who were very pale.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah. I guess that's just me, but my feeling is it takes so much concentration, empathy, intelligence to get by day to day that I don't have the energy. Even before I got cancer, I don't think I had the energy to worry about what was past. To me, the present is all consuming, and I think I've always been that way. But, that doesn't mean I don't think it's valid. I think anything that anyone is interested in and means something to them is something they should explore. I feel that very much. For me personally, it's not. I think in both my marriages, I've been married to men who are very active and full. And it's been a big challenge just to live with them. And there hasn't been, I can truthfully say I never have felt bored by myself or with other people. Even when I was at home with the kids, the little kids, I'd be reading. So I've never felt bored.
You have a deep interest in people.
I do, yeah, I do. I love reading the obituaries, especially now. I look to see how many ovarian cancer people there are. And when the last time I went to Dr. Chen, I said, I've been noticing the last couple months there's a lot of ovarian, and she laughed. And her intern said, you read the obituaries? And Dr. Chen said, I do too. The stories. Well, there was one recently, obviously written by the husband of this woman who had died, said her greatest joy and pleasure in life was making her husband happy. I thought, oh my God, I said to John, if you ever write such a thing. And then someone else told me, you shouldn't put obituaries in the paper, because then the robbers know when to come and rob your house, because nobody's going to be home when you say the funeral will be at so-and-so.
That's kind of silly.
Well, I don't want a funeral. I want to give my body to science, but I don't know if they'll want it. There's no parts of me probably they can use because of the cancer, but maybe they can use it for pathology. So the first time I went to poor Dr. Chen, I said, I want to give my body for research. She said, well, it's a little soon to be talking about that. So I'll go back to it later.
So have you, mortality, do you feel like you've been, thinking about,
The end?
The end, I mean, do you have?
I don't think you do. I think even when you have a serious illness, well, maybe some people do, and maybe again, if you have a religious feeling, you do. But I I do not have, I certainly do not believe in any kind of supreme being. So I feel that, you know, when you're dead, that's it. And I feel I'm going to be 75 in a week, I think, next Wednesday. And I feel very fortunate that I've lived this long, especially when I see young people with cancer, when I go for treatment, or when I read the obituaries about young people. So to me, you know, when you reach this age in your 70s, you're going to go of something. So I seem to know what I'm going to go of. Though I said that to a nurse, I said, because there was a young, very attractive woman, around 28, across in another room, and I said, oh, I hate to see young women, you know, who have it. And I said, at least at my age, I know what I'm going to go of. And she said, no, you could have a stroke or a heart attack. I said, oh.
Car accident.
I think each person I know, friends and relatives, denies something. I obviously did with my first marriage, and I'm sure I do now. I know I don't like to read a lot about cancer. I've got a lot of books around, but I'm just not interested in reading about it. It's like, so if it's going to help me ask better questions, then I'll read it. But I don't want to know all that stuff. So that's probably a form of denial right there. But I do think denying things is big on our thing, and maybe that's how a lot of immigrant families are. They have to do that to survive.
Well, I mean, there must have been an amazing amount of loss. I mean, they had to feel, I mean, the loss. And the you know, nowadays you'd say, oh, they had post-traumatic stress and they passed it on.
Yeah.
Because they didn't talk much about the old.
No, that's another thing. You didn't, I mean, but that again was that whole generational thing. You know, I have friends who found out after their mothers died, 2 or 3, that they had been married before. Because in that era, to be divorced was shame incarnate. And that isn't true now. Now, that doesn't mean people are acting better now because of the high divorce rate, which is known. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. To me, in my era, the fact that you never talked about feelings at home seemed, you know, really not right. Now, I guess you do talk more. Are people happier? I don't know.
I mean, why do you think that you had this need for the truth and to talk about feelings? Why weren't you more in consistency?
Because I felt isolated. I didn't feel part of the family unit. Number one, we had a live-in young woman called Fanny who was of Polish descent. And apparently she was almost like a nanny to me because people used to say, oh, she's Fanny's baby. I mean, that was supposed to be a joke, but for a 1, 2, and 3-year-old, that was confusing. And I didn't speak till I was 3, so there was confusion hearing the 2 languages, too. So I think that established that I was different from the rest of the family. I guess. So I had to find out who I was and what I was. And in many ways that made me strong. And in other ways it made me not have the confidence I could have had.
Was your mother supportive?
Not at all. Her great thing was that she wanted her 3 daughters to go to college. And that, again, was not that common among Greek immigrant families, or even for the general population, but she was very clear about that. And my father went along. He didn't oppose her, but he wouldn't have felt it was that important.
So that was her greatest.
Yeah, yes.
So,
And she apparently, according to Albert and Michael and Diane, was wonderful with them. They felt a lot of warmth from her. So I think, again, with a lot of people, they're under such pressure, no matter what generation, with their own children. Then when they have grandchildren, which Albert, Michael, and Diane were like to my mother, they can relax. But I've talked to them. I've talked to Albert and Kay about it a couple times, and Albert always says he just remembers her being, very loving and nice to them. It's totally different. Yeah, yeah.
Is there any advice or comments you'd like to make right now?
To future family members?
Yeah. Or those who might become curious in the future after they...
Well, I still feel, obviously education is extremely important, but I also feel looking into your behavior, why you act the way you do, why what bothers you, because usually you find what bothers you in other people the most is what you're trying to figure out about yourself. I just think keeping that probing, asking, is extremely necessary in this world. And as a human being, you have to know and ask as much of yourself as possible. I also feel a very, very, very important connection with other people. And the thing that really bothers me so much around here is all these little families become so self-contained that there could be a starving person on their driveway and they would step over them because it didn't fit in with their schedule. And you understand why that's happened because the pressures are so great. But I think we just have to be connected with others. We have to feel responsible. We have to contribute. Even tutoring in the schools is something that has to be done. And I have wonderful friends who are very liberal and very democratic. And when it comes to talking about kids in the ghetto, their attitude is, well, they should just, get it together and get out. And I say, but you know what the conditions are? I've been in those homes because I worked with those kids. You gotta help. You gotta be aware. Be aware. That's what I think is important.
Do you think we've become more automatized?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, do you think that the community...
Yeah, it's around here anyway. Maybe those are some of the good qualities of the Midwest. Like when I go to Ohio, everybody says, hello, how are you? Blue, blah, blee. And the South, too. I'm sure that's true. I don't know how deep it is or how sincere, but I think connections are extremely important, if nothing else, to teach you humility about your level.